One photograph. In over 140 years, across millions of tintypes, daguerreotypes, and prints produced in the American West, only one authenticated photograph of the most famous outlaw in American history has ever been confirmed. Billy the Kid, a legend worth millions, captured in a single image, and people will do almost anything to create a second one. That single photograph sold for $2.3 million at auction, and in its wake, a cottage industry of fraud, false hope, and high-tech deception has spent the last decade trying to manufacture another one. Think about that for a moment. The most legendary gunslinger in American history, the subject of over 50 films, hundreds of books, a figure so iconic his name is shorthand for rebellion itself, and we have exactly one confirmed photograph of his face. What you're about to see is a story of greed dressed up as history, of technology weaponized to confirm what people desperately wanted to believe, and of a photographic record so thin, so fragile, that a single lie could have rewritten it forever. The Silver City tintype was supposed to be the discovery of a lifetime, a childhood photo of Billy the Kid surrounded by family. But the entire case was built on a foundation that had already been demolished decades earlier, and nobody checked. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a retired New York City Police Department detective, a junk shop bargain, and a National Geographic special all tried and failed to rewrite the photographic record of the Wild West. You'll see what the fatal flaw was in the detective's evidence that nobody caught. You'll learn how a $2 photograph nearly became worth $5 million, and you'll understand why it keeps happening. This is one of the strangest detective stories the Old West has ever produced. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of deception hidden in American history, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the myths we think we know. Now let me take you back to a dusty saloon in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, and the only photograph that started it all. Billy the Kid, born Henry McCarty, later known as William Bonney, needs no elaborate biography here. You already have a mental image of him, young, dangerous, mythologized beyond all recognition. What matters for this story is not his gunfights or his death at 21, but what he left behind, or rather what he didn't leave behind. The American West was awash in photography by the 1870s and 80s. Itinerant photographers set up shop in saloons, general stores, and makeshift studios across the frontier. Thousands of men and women sat for portraits: cowboys, miners, school teachers, outlaws. Billy, apparently, sat for exactly one session. In an era when even anonymous ranch hands posed for the camera, Billy the Kid, the most wanted man in the territory, left behind almost nothing. Sometime in late 1879 or early 1880, in a saloon in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, Billy sat for a tintype. He was about 18 years old. He held a Winchester rifle, and he had what historians have described as a goofy look, a half-smirk, slightly awkward, not the steely-eyed killer of dime novel legend. 4 nearly identical originals were produced during that session. Billy reportedly disliked the image. He gave copies to friends, one to Dan Dedrick, a friend who was involved in counterfeiting and who let Billy use his ranch as a hideout, and others to people in his orbit, including through Paulita Maxwell, his girlfriend. The surviving Dedrick copy is the one that endures. Its chain of ownership, from the Dedrick family forward through documented hands across more than a century, is unbroken, verified by historians. No serious scholar disputes it. And here's the detail that makes everything else in this story possible. Tintypes were not negatives. There were no copies you could strike from a master plate. Each tintype was a unique, one-of-a-kind original, a thin sheet of iron coated in light-sensitive chemicals, producing a single unrepeatable image in the dim light of a frontier saloon. Lose it, and it's gone forever. Which means for any tintype to be authenticated, you need provenance, a documented, unbroken chain of ownership connecting the image to the person in it. Provenance isn't a technicality. It's the difference between a priceless artifact and a worthless piece of tin. Now, you might think, one photo? That can't be right. Surely someone, somewhere, snapped another picture of the most famous outlaw in the territory. And that instinct, that disbelief, is exactly what the fraudsters counted on. This single surviving authenticated photo sat in relative obscurity for over a century. It was a historical curiosity. Remarkable, yes, but stable, unchallenged. Then, in 2011, everything changed. Not because a new photo was found, but because someone paid an extraordinary price for the old one. What happens when a single photograph of a dead outlaw becomes worth more than most people will earn in a lifetime? The answer involves retired detectives, television producers, facial recognition software, and a lie that was decades old. In June of 2011, the authenticated Fort Sumner tintype went to auction. Billionaire William Koch purchased it for $2.3 million, making it one of the most expensive photographs ever sold. The sale was a seismic event. Overnight, every dusty tintype in every attic, junk shop, and eBay listing in America became a potential lottery ticket. Koch's purchase didn't just buy a photograph. It bought a gold rush. A wave of claims flooded in almost immediately. Unprovenanced tintypes surfaced at estate sales, in online auctions, in dresser drawers. Each one came with a hopeful story attached. My great-grandmother said this was Billy the Kid. The face matches. Just look at the cheekbones. Historians began sounding alarms, and the warnings were clear and consistent. Without provenance, a tintype of a young man from the 1880s is just a tintype of a young man from the 1880s. Nothing more. For every legitimate historian urging caution, there were a dozen treasure hunters convinced they were holding a fortune in their hands. And the scammers took notice. $2. Remember that number. It's going to become very important. Into this gold rush atmosphere stepped Michael Furier, a retired New York City Police Department detective with a dramatic story to tell. Around 2023, Furier publicly championed what became known as the Silver City tintype, a photograph that purportedly showed Billy the Kid as a child or young teenager in Silver City, New Mexico, surrounded by family members, possibly including his mother, Catherine McCarty Antrim. Furier wasn't a random treasure hunter posting on internet forums. He was a detective, a man who had spent a career identifying suspects and building cases from fragments of evidence. He brought the credibility of law enforcement and the confidence of someone trained to read faces. And he had technology. Furier approached the photograph the way he'd approached a cold case, with conviction, determination, and an absolute certainty that he already knew who the suspect was. Furier's weapon of choice was facial recognition software. He ran the Silver City image against the Fort Sumner tintype and against other alleged Billy-linked photographs, claiming the software confirmed matches and even familial connections between the people in the images. A retired detective, cutting-edge software, and a photograph that could rewrite 140 years of history. It was exactly the kind of story the media couldn't resist. The Silver City photo was positioned as a revelation, not just a second photo of Billy, but a family portrait. Billy as a young person, alongside his mother, in the town where he spent part of his childhood. The combination of Furier's law enforcement background and the technological sheen of facial recognition gave the claims an aura of scientific authority. The promise was intoxicating. After over a century of having only one image of the most famous outlaw in American history, here, finally, was another. Now, if you're already skeptical, good. But what happened next made even seasoned historians do a double take. Billy the Kid scholars were already raising red flags. The photo had no provenance, no documented chain of ownership linking it to Billy or his family. The facial recognition methodology was untested on historical tintypes, and some of the comparison images Furier was using had their own deeply buried problems. The warnings were there from the beginning. Nobody wanted to hear them, But the Silver City tintype wasn't the first attempt to manufacture a second Billy the Kid photo. Before Furrier and his software, there was another claim, one that had the backing of National Geographic, primetime television, and a photograph that cost exactly $2. The year is 2015. A tintype purchased at a junk shop for approximately $2 surfaces with a staggering claim. It shows Billy the Kid playing croquet. The image itself is a casual outdoor scene, a group of people gathered around a croquet game, sunlight falling across a lawn. Among them stands a youth wearing a striped sweater. The claim is that this youth is Billy the Kid, the tall, mustached man nearby. Pat Garrett, the lawman who would eventually kill Billy. Also allegedly present in the frame, members of the Regulators, Billy's gang, including Charlie Bowdre. A $2 photograph, a croquet game, and supposedly 2 men who would become mortal enemies, caught in the same frame in a moment of leisure that history never recorded. If authenticated, the photograph would be worth up to $5 million. What followed was not a discovery, but a performance. Now, pause for a second. You might be wondering, how does National Geographic get this wrong? How do networks like NPR and NBC report a junk shop photo as if it's confirmed? The answer is simpler and more uncomfortable than you'd think. The story was irresistible. And in media, irresistible stories have a way of outrunning evidence. This wasn't a fringe claim posted on a message board. National Geographic produced a primetime television special called Billy the Kid, New Evidence. The full weight of one of the most trusted brands in documentary media was thrown behind the croquet photograph. The authentication team was assembled with care designed to impress. Kent Gibson performed facial recognition analysis and declared the image a match. Will Dunniway, a wet plate photography expert, examined the tintype itself and dated it to approximately 1878, the right period for Billy's activities in Lincoln County. Darren Rasper, involved in the analysis, called the probability close to certain. Facial recognition. Period-accurate materials. Expert testimony. On paper, the case looked airtight. But here's the detail that should have stopped everyone in their tracks. The provenance, that unbroken chain of ownership connecting image to identity, was assembled after the fact. After the special aired, a link was constructed tying the photograph to Benjamin Bowdre, brother of Charlie Bowdre, one of the Regulators allegedly shown in the image. Before the television cameras rolled, this chain of ownership simply did not exist. The photograph had emerged from a junk shop bin, from among stacks of anonymous tintypes piled like playing cards, decades of forgotten faces waiting for someone to claim them. The media response was overwhelming. NPR, NBC, and other outlets ran headlines treating the croquet photo as virtually confirmed. New photo of Billy the Kid found. Second Billy the Kid photo verified. The headlines were everywhere. The story had everything: a rags-to-riches discovery, high-tech confirmation, and the romance of the Old West. What it didn't have was the one thing that actually mattered. Almost immediately, historians pushed back, and their objections were devastating. Dan Buck, a respected historian of the Lincoln County War era, identified the fundamental methodological flaw with surgical precision. The investigators had started with the assumption that the photo showed Billy, then worked backward to find supporting evidence. Cart before horse, Buck called it. They hadn't asked who is in this photo. They had asked, how can we prove this is Billy? The question itself was poisoned from the start. The facial recognition analysis came under specific and damaging fire. Experts in the technology noted that the software was designed for high-resolution, standardized modern photographs, not degraded 140-year-old tintypes with inconsistent lighting. Chemical deterioration. And subjects who may have shifted during exposures that lasted several seconds. Running facial recognition on a tintype is like trying to match fingerprints through a pair of oven mitts. The tool isn't designed for the medium. the results aren't just unreliable, they're meaningless. And this is where the story of the croquet tintype connects directly to the Silver City photograph, in a way that nobody involved seems to have anticipated. The final verdict on the croquet photo came not from academia, but from the marketplace. Don Kaggin, a prominent numismatist and dealer in historical artifacts, was offered the croquet tintype and rejected it. His assessment was blunt: no value. In a single afternoon of expert testimony, a $2 photograph lost its $5 million future. When the people whose business is literally selling historical artifacts won't touch a photograph, the message is unmistakable. The croquet tintype was widely rejected by the historical community. The National Geographic special drew sharp criticism for sensationalizing a case built on sand. The producers grew defensive. The headlines quietly disappeared. The $2 photo did not become a $5 million artifact, it became a cautionary tale. But it was a cautionary tale that not everyone learned from. Because 8 years later, a retired detective would use the exact same playbook, facial recognition, media hype, and backwards logic, on a photograph with even less evidence behind it. And this time, the foundation of the entire claim rested on a single comparison image, an image that had already been exposed as a fraud decades ago. Before we examine the specific evidence against the Silver City photo, we need to understand why the primary tool used to authenticate it was the wrong tool for the job from the very beginning. Modern facial recognition systems work by mapping dozens of facial landmarks: the distance between eyes, the ratio of nose width to face width, the angle of the jawline, and comparing those measurements against databases of high-resolution, well-lit, standardized photographs. In controlled environments with modern cameras and cooperative subjects, the technology is genuinely remarkable. It can unlock your phone. It can match a suspect to a security camera still. It can process thousands of faces per second with startling accuracy. But a tintype from the 1870s or 80s is the opposite of a controlled environment. The chemical process used to create the image introduces distortions that no algorithm can reliably account for. Exposure times were long, often several seconds, meaning subjects frequently shifted, producing subtle blurring of the very features the software needs to map. Lighting was inconsistent, governed by whatever window light or lamp happened to be available in a frontier saloon or open field. And the images themselves have endured 140 years of chemical decay, scratches, water damage, and environmental degradation that alters the geometry of faces in ways the software interprets as data points rather than damage. As Buck bluntly assessed, the technology was worthless for this purpose. And this isn't just about Billy the Kid. Every tintype authentication that relies primarily on facial recognition software is built on the same methodological quicksand. Without provenance, without that documented chain of ownership, software matches prove nothing. They generate numbers, they produce confidence percentages, they create the appearance of scientific rigor. But the inputs are corrupt, and corrupt inputs produce corrupt outputs, no matter how sophisticated the algorithm. Now, you might think, okay, facial recognition isn't perfect, but surely it provides some evidence, some indication that merits further investigation? Here's why the answer is no. The software doesn't know it's looking at a tintype. It doesn't adjust for chemical distortion. It doesn't account for the fact that the image has been degrading for over a century. It treats every pixel as reliable data. When you feed it two degraded historical images and ask if they match, you aren't getting a scientific result. You're getting a mathematical coincidence dressed up in a lab coat. Remember, each tintype was a one-of-a-kind original. There's no negative to trace back to a studio, no photographer's log matching a name to a sitting. The object itself carries no identifying information. Provenance is the only tether connecting image to identity. And the Silver City tintype had no provenance whatsoever. But it had something worse than no evidence. It had evidence that had already been destroyed. Furia, the retired detective who brought his cold case instincts to the Silver City photograph, had built his entire case on facial recognition matches. But matches to what? He didn't limit his comparisons to the Fort Sumner tintype, the single confirmed photograph. He ran the Silver City image against multiple alleged Billy-linked photographs, casting a wide net of supposed connections. Among those comparison images, he included a photograph long identified as Catherine McCarty Antrim, Billy's mother. If that comparison held up, the implications would be extraordinary. Not just a second photo of Billy, but a family portrait, mother and son, captured together in the town where Billy spent part of his childhood. The familial connections the software supposedly detected would transform the Silver City tintype from a curiosity into a revelation. And this is the detail that demolished the entire case. That photograph of Catherine McCarty Antrim had been exposed as a misidentification decades before Furia ever picked it up. It wasn't Billy's mother, it was a random frontier woman. Nobody. An unidentified face on an unprovenanced tintype that had been misattributed years ago, debunked by historians who had done the unglamorous work of checking the documentary record, and apparently forgotten by everyone who wanted the Silver City story to be true. The detective was matching an unknown photograph against another unknown photograph, and calling the result proof. He wasn't solving a cold case, he was building a house on a foundation that had already been condemned. Every familial connection the software detected was meaningless. The algorithm wasn't identifying Billy's family. It was finding vague geometric similarities between the faces of random 19th-century people, which, given the limitations of tintype photography and the distortions of chemical decay, it would do with alarming and entirely meaningless frequency. 7 billion faces on Earth. With enough motivation, you can convince yourself that any two of them match. Beyond the software catastrophe, experts who examined the Silver City photo on its own terms found further problems. The facial structure of the subject didn't match the authenticated Fort Sumner image. Superficially, there was a resemblance, the kind of resemblance you find when you're already looking for it. But under scrutiny, the bone structure, the proportions, the specific geometry of the features diverged in ways that couldn't be explained by age difference alone. The photograph didn't align with what historians know about Billy's movements and family circumstances in Silver City. The when and the where of the image didn't match the when and where of Billy's documented life. The Silver City tintype had no documented ownership history. None. No chain linking it to Billy, to his family, to Silver City, to anyone connected to the kid's life. It appeared, was claimed, and was promoted, all without the one piece of evidence that separates a historical artifact from a piece of scrap metal. No provenance, no valid comparison, no case. The technology was the same unreliable tool that couldn't do the job. The comparison images were fraudulent. The provenance was non-existent. The timeline didn't work. And yet the story kept circulating because people wanted it to be true. History didn't pivot on this moment. Fraud did. The croquet tintype and the Silver City photograph are separated by 8 years. Different people, different images, different media campaigns. But the playbook is identical. Step 1. Start with an unprovenanced image. Neither photo had a documented chain of ownership before its public claims were made. Step 2. Apply facial recognition. In both cases, software designed for modern photographs was applied to degraded historical tintypes, producing matches that no serious technologist would endorse for this medium. Step 3. Reverse engineer the provenance. The croquet photo's link to Benjamin Beaudry was assembled after the National Geographic special aired. The Silver City photo's familial connections were generated by comparing it against images that were themselves unverified, or worse, already debunked. Step 4. Leverage media amplification. National Geographic for the croquet photo. Various outlets and online platforms for the Silver City image. In both cases, headlines outran evidence by miles. Step 5. Dismiss expert criticism. Historians who raised red flags were treated as gatekeepers standing in the way of discovery, not as voices of methodological rigor doing their jobs. And here's what makes this pattern so dangerous. It works, not because the evidence is convincing, but because the story is a detective solving a cold case, a junk shop treasure worth millions, technology confirming what the naked eye suspects. These are narratives engineered for maximum emotional appeal, and they exploit the gap between what sounds true and what is true. Every step of this pattern traces back to Koch's millions and the 2011 sale. That auction didn't just set a price for a photograph, it set a bounty. And bounty hunters don't always play by the rules, as Buck warned about the croquet photo, cart before horse. The same could be said of the Silver City claim, with one grim addition. The horse was dead before they hitched the cart to it. In the years following the 2011 sale, unprovenanced tintypes flooded online marketplaces. Some sellers were genuinely hopeful, ordinary people who found old photographs and let their imaginations run ahead of their evidence. Others knew exactly what they were doing. Historians became exhausted, debunking claims that multiplied faster than they could be addressed. The Billy the Kid photo industry isn't about history. It's about hope. The hope that a $2 piece of tin might be worth $2 million. And hope, when there's money involved, is the most dangerous thing in the world. The asymmetry of fraud cuts deep. It takes 5 minutes to make a claim and 5 years to debunk it. The headlines announcing a new Billy the Kid photo are always louder than the retractions that follow. So where does this leave us? 1 authenticated photograph, 2 high-profile frauds, and a historical record that remains exactly as thin as it was before anyone started looking. Billy the Kid scholars reject the Silver City photograph outright. The consensus is clear, unambiguous, and arrived at through the kind of methodical scrutiny that should have been applied before a single headline was written. The authentication leaned on elements that were debunked before Furia ever picked up the photograph. The misidentified frontier woman, the image that wasn't Catherine McCarty Antrim, had been exposed years earlier. Furia either didn't know or didn't care. The same unreliable technology was applied to the same impossible medium with the same predictable results. The provenance it never had was never going to materialize. The Silver City tintype wasn't exposed by some dramatic counter-investigation. It fell apart under the most basic historical scrutiny, the kind of questioning that any first-year graduate student would know to apply. As of the time of this video, only one authenticated photograph of Billy the Kid exists, the Fort Sumner tintype. One photograph still. The damage, however, extends far beyond a single rejected claim. Consider the historians, scholars, who have spent decades studying Billy the Kid and the Lincoln County War, who found themselves forced to repeatedly debunk claims that should never have gained traction. Their expertise was drowned out by spectacle. The $2 junk shop find alone consumed years of public discourse. The Silver City photo added another cycle of the same exhausting process, pulling researchers away from genuine historical work to play whack-a-mole with manufactured evidence. Consider the collectors. Legitimate dealers and numismatists like Kargin found themselves navigating a marketplace polluted by hopeful fakes. Every auction, every estate sale, every online listing required heightened skepticism. The sale that should have been a triumph for historical preservation instead became an engine of fraud, poisoning the very market it enriched. And consider the public. For ordinary people who watched the National Geographic special or read the headlines about the Silver City photo, the damage was subtler but profoundly real. Trust in authentication, in the idea that experts and technology can reliably determine what's real, was eroded. When National Geographic promotes a photograph that historians reject, who does the public believe? The answer, too often, is whichever story sounds better. And this is the part of the story that should worry you the most. The debunkings of both photographs, circulated primarily through historical communities, niche publications, and detailed analyses by independent researchers, not through the mainstream outlets that had amplified the original claims. NPR and NBC ran the exciting story. The correction never got the same play. The lie flew around the world. The truth is still putting on its boots. The original claims benefited from narrative appeal, a detective, a discovery, technology confirming a mystery. The debunkings required patience, technical understanding, and a willingness to accept that the exciting answer was wrong. That's a harder sell. It will always be a harder sell. And as long as the incentives remain unchanged, the cycle will continue. The forces that produced the croquet tintype and the Silver City photograph haven't gone away. They're waiting for the next unprovenanced image to surface. The Billy the Kid photo authentication industry will not stop. The financial incentive is too powerful. A single authenticated image could be worth millions, and as long as that bounty exists, unprovenanced tintypes will continue to surface with claims of identification attached. For historians, the lesson that emerges from both frauds is unequivocal. Provenance is non-negotiable. Technology cannot replace documentation. Software cannot replace a chain of custody. No amount of facial mapping can substitute for a piece of paper that says, "This photograph was taken of this person on this date in this place." The age of blind faith in technology ended with a tintype and a lie. The broader consequence is perhaps the cruelest irony of all. Every fraudulent claim that gains media traction makes it harder for a real discovery to be taken seriously. The noise drowns the signal. If a genuine second photograph of Billy the Kid ever surfaces, legitimate and provenanced and verifiable, it will emerge into a landscape so contaminated by false claims that even honest evidence will be met with suspicion. The greatest casualty of the Billy the Kid photo wars isn't money or reputation, it's the possibility that a real discovery might be dismissed as just another fake. Why does one photograph hold so much power? Because Billy the Kid exists almost entirely in myth. He was killed at 21. His life was short, violent, and almost immediately fictionalized by dime novelists and newspaper writers who cared more about sensation than accuracy. The Fort Sumner tintype is the only tether between the legend and a real human face. That goofy-looking teenager with the rifle, he doesn't look like a legendary outlaw. He looks like a kid, awkward, young, unsure of what to do with his expression while a photographer worked behind a cumbersome camera in a dim frontier saloon. And maybe that's why the photograph is so valuable and why so many people want to find another one. Because the single real image doesn't match the myth. People want a version that does. We don't want more photos of Billy the Kid because we need them. We want them because we can't accept that the most famous outlaw in American history looked like the kid who'd stock shelves at your local general store. One photograph. After everything, the detectives, the software, the television specials, the junk shop bargains, the headlines, the debunkings, we are exactly where we started. One authenticated photograph of Billy the Kid, the Fort Sumner tintype, a goofy-looking teenager holding a rifle in a saloon in New Mexico, faded, imperfect, small enough to hold in your palm, a young man who didn't want his picture taken, preserved in a medium that was never meant to last 140 years, but somehow did. And maybe that's enough. Maybe one real image of a real person is worth more than 1,000 manufactured fantasies. Because that single piece of tin, fragile, faded, chemically decaying with every passing year, is the only honest thing left in a story that has been buried under a century and a half of lies. One image, one truth. If you want more stories like this where history fights back against fraud, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.